Well, hello, it's Andrew again, and today is episode 38. We pick the Gospel of Matthew up today in chapter 12, verses 22 and 23. And so we read, "Then they brought to Jesus a demoniac who was blind and mute. And he cured him so that the one who had been mute could speak and see. All the crowds were amazed and said, 'Can this be the son of David?' It first struck me as peculiar that this man was both blind and mute. No mention is made of his capacity to hear. One probably needs to assume that his hearing is not affected, that he's not hearing impaired. That as people talk to him, it's obvious that he understands, even though he may not speak. I sat with this prayer for a while, wondering what it would be like, what it might feel like. I will encourage you, it's worth taking a few moments to sit quietly and to seek to enter into that space. You can lay aside the whole demonic stuff for a moment and simply sit with not seeing and with not talking while being able to hear. I was left wondering if the muteness followed the blindness and that his world had simply collapsed around him and he no longer was willing to communicate. Or if, in fact, the power of speech was deprived him and his sight faded as he turned in on himself. Was this a chicken or egg situation? What came first? The blindness or the muteness? Did one follow the other as a consequence of the other? That he was struck either blind and kind of gave up on life and stopped communicating, or that he became mute, unable to speak even though he desperately wanted to, and ultimately caved in on himself. His world collapses. He loses the power of sight, loses any vision for what life might look like. After all, what's the point? Can you find yourself entering into this? Or maybe it was both the chicken and the egg, that he simultaneously lost the power of both sight and speech. What a miserable existence for him. Part of the tragedy is that it now defines him. He is now known as demoniac. He's no longer a man troubled by a demon, no longer a man who was blind or mute, or blind and mute. He is now a demoniac. It now has apparently claimed the whole of him. His whole life is circumscribed by this fact, and it now determines who he is. It strikes me as symptomatic of many of us in our inability or unwillingness to rise above our circumstances, and we become victims of them. We become defined by them. We settle into a place of helplessness and hopelessness, a victim of our circumstances. It's just the way it is, and there's apparently no will to change. I've seen this before, not in someone who's blind and or mute. I've seen it in people who at some level choose not to rise above their situation or circumstances. They sink and settle into it. They've become victims to it. It is almost invariably someone else's fault and someone else's responsibility to lift them out of their situation. Except when push comes to shove, they don't really want to be lifted out. This place has become familiar. They know what it looks like, what it feels like, inside out. There are no surprises, and best of all, no further disappointments. To seek to rise above it? Well, they may have tried this before, and the crashing down was too painful to want to repeat. Staying down is safe and known. It may be unpleasant and somewhat painful, yet it's familiar and unpleasantly comfortable in its own way. It may be that I am projecting a huge amount onto this poor, sad demoniac with the skimpiest of evidence. I probably am. Yet we need to hear him speak to us in our day, in our situation. What might he say to you? What might he say to me? What might either of us need to hear from him, from this blind, mute man who either cannot or will not see, who cannot or will not speak? This man needs a reset, one that he's not afraid to embrace. Ultimately, it's fear that so often keeps us from healing. Fear of what being whole might look like. Fear of being unable to sustain the healing and come crashing down to a worse place than before. Fear of the expectations of others and myself as to what might be required of me now that I'm whole. I now have to take responsibility for my life and for my part in the wider community. That could be scary. The tragedy is, it's so often fear of what we might stand to lose, even when we have nothing to lose, that overwhelms the vision of all that we stand to gain. I'll repeat that. The tragedy is that it is so often fear of what we perceive we might stand to lose, even when we have nothing to lose, that overwhelms the vision of all that we stand to gain. We perhaps see this most graphically portrayed in the story in John 5 of the healing of the man at the side of the pool of Bethesda. He'd been there, waiting for his turn for 38 years. And it was always somebody else's fault when his turn didn't come. Jesus asks him the one question that matters. Do you want to get well? At which he launches into the talk of the unfairness of it all and that it's not his fault. And he's still here. Jesus almost gives the impression of being a little irritated and simply commands a healing. After 38 years, this man is set free. And one is left with the suspicion that he's not necessarily as grateful or as positive about it as one might expect. Being whole imparts a measure of responsibility. It brings an expectation that we're going to get up and at least attempt to live up to our destiny, the God-appointed reason why we're here, which transcends simply being pathetic, helpless and hopeless. As I've said, I've put a lot onto this poor man, much more than the text warrants. He simply needs to be set free. And Jesus gloriously comes to the party. The man is given his life back. no longer just a label. He is released into being a God-appointed, God-equipped, God-empowered, functioning member of his community. What did that look like? I have no idea. I do know that God's hand was upon his life, and God has now given him the choice as to whether or not he's going to step up and live the life he has been given back, or not. As we finish, let's return to the passage for just a moment. Let's notice it's the power of speech that is referred to first, not the blindness. He speaks and sees. Perhaps an indication that Jesus has first helped them to see that the blindness will not define him before he is cured even of that. We all need to see the gifts, graces, and possibilities that are ours, right under our noses, if only we're willing to notice. God bless you.